Prospectus, Grace Lavery. This book makes two claims, the second dependent upon the first, about gender transition as it has been experienced and represented in the modern period, roughly 1850 to the present. Gender transition is a somewhat euphemistic term, with certain advantages over sex change, but certain disadvantages as well. I use them roughly interchangeably to refer to any kind of process by which a person may make changes to their body on the grounds of transsexual or transgender ideation, any kind of process by which a person may make changes to their legal or social personhood, such as by changing names or requesting to be referred to by new pronouns, any kind of psychic reorientation by which a person may come to understand themselves as belonging to a different sex class, including a new, fictive, imaginary, or negative class than the one to which they were assigned at birth. I make no ontological distinction between binary and non-binary presentations of transition, but where non-binary presentations appear in this book, they are inevitably associated to some degree with sex as a system of somatic classification. I therefore exclude such transitions as are concerned solely with gender and not with sex at all from my discussion, primarily because I have not seen such transitions represented in the literature I have studied. This will appear to some as an unnecessarily broad way of defining an experience that, after all, affects few people to such a degree that they reorient their entire lives around it. Yet while transsexual commitment in its most profound form is a relatively rare phenomenon in the archives I have been examining, various degrees of transsexual ideation, orientation, or experimentation are much more common. Indeed, according to the reading of psychoanalysis I advance here, they are not merely common but practically universal. I therefore bypass entirely the question of whether a historical figure such as George Eliot, assigned female at birth, but relatively committed to a masculine pseudonym which we still use, is trans. Insofar as a given person adopted a masculine pseudonym, that person transitioned. To the degree that Eliot's writing explores the viability of identifying with a masculine or male position, then it may be said to be exploring the possibility of transition. These historical inclusions are especially necessary, given the bizarre and ahistorical arguments of contemporary anti-trans historians such as Jane Clare Jones and Selina Todd, who argue that nobody transitioned before the late 20th century, the late 1900s. The attempt to isolate trans experiences from history serves the political goal of isolating trans people from the LGBT communities, among which we have lived, loved, and fought for more than a century and a half. This book's first claim is that representations of transition in the modern period have exhibited a profound ambivalence concerning the ontological condition of the transsexual, whether or not the transsexual now belongs to the sex class into which the transition has sought to place them, and that this ontological conundrum has determined the characters of both anti-trans oppression and the civil rights claims with which trans people have usually confronted it. This problematic has emerged strangely entangled with the history of psychoanalysis. Though Freud wrote about transsexuality rarely, and in his notes on the Schreiber case, characterized the condition as psychotic, by the end of his career the related conditions of penis envy and castration complex had become more or less definitive of neurosis, and therefore not merely universal, in the sense that everyone has them, but the bedrock, as Freud calls it in Analysis Terminable and Interminable, of the neurotic subject's latent condition. While Freud died shortly after writing that paper, and therefore had no chance to further develop his understanding of a primal universal transsexuality, later readers of psychoanalysis, especially those following Lacan, have explored the ontological implications of Freud's insights in a variety of ways. Yet, partly because of Lacan's idiosyncratic understanding of the therapeutic function of psychoanalysis, critics have yet to grapple fully with the pragmatic dimension of Freud's understanding of castration complex, penis envy, which I can join thus because, ultimately, Freud understood them as variant presentations of the same condition. So, by considering the context in which transsexuality presented to Freud as a peculiar type of ontological foundation, I aim to restore to view the therapeutic apparatus that psychoanalysis was to have been. My second claim derives from the first. In the face of the ontological problematization of transsexuality, A trans-feminist strain of embodied thought, or praxis, has sought to enable trans life by sidestepping ontologization and, rather than asking what the transsexual is, instead developing techniques by which transitions might be more fully effectuated. This trans-pragmatism affirms in all places that transition works, that despite expectations, it is possible, and that it happens. The politics of trans-pragmatism have consisted of a resistance to the ontologizing demands of medicalization, pathologization, and even liberal accounts of irresistible LGBT interiority, and the development of methods for passing, the acrobatics of the penile tuck, for example, for cultivating pleasure, the trans-specific sexual techniques documented in contemporary zine culture, and for evading various forms of racial and sexual surveillance. As an essentially pragmatic philosophy, the trans-cultivation of technique has been neither essentialist nor anti-essentialist, insofar as those terms have organized much of the political content of feminist thought since the 1970s. Nonetheless, trans women especially have figured as the scapegoat for a critical branch of feminist thought which understands reproductive capacity, in the biological rather than Marxist sense of the term, as the sole grounds of the oppression of women. Though this branch of trans-exclusionary radical feminism, TERF, was relegated to the sidelines of feminist organizing from its inception in the early 1980s until the last few years, since the so-called trans tipping point of circa 2014, anti-trans feminism has suddenly become a massive cultural force, aligned with religious and social conservatives in the pursuit of trans-exclusionary social policy. While TERFism seeks the full ontologization of transsexuality along essentially liberal lines, trans-pragmatism operates as an informal but global mutual aid society, with trans people online swapping practical tips for evading state capture in much the same way as their Victorian and early modernist forebears. The book advances these claims in 2 sets of essays and an epilogue, which have been organized to pursue the argument in its logical sequence, but also to explore the generic and cultural logics by which these historical and political conditions have become knowable, both to trans people and to the world at large. The first sequence of essays, How to Change Sex Like a Pragmatist, Part 1, draws on the perhaps unexpected traditions of philosophical and literary realism to sketch out a logical grounds for transition, exploring a number of canonical treatments of sex, volition, and technique in George Eliot, Sigmund Freud, Ernst Kantorowicz, Charles Dickens, Theodore Adorno, and Alfred Tennyson. The second sequence, How to Survive Negation, Part 2, begins to demarcate some of the generic lineaments that transition has engendered, albeit that in some cases, the literal referent of transsexuality seems rather remote. Cultural criticism as theorized by Matthew Arnold, the queer essay Sin Sontag, the serial killer narrative, and the stoner neo-noir. Finally, in the book's epilogue, I examine the trans cover version as a distinctive musical genre of transition, glancing back over Kevin Rowland's album My Beauty and the output of the indie record label VVM Test Records to reinterpret the Kantian condition of subjective universality that governs both this book's method and the condition of many of its objects. The book therefore covers a long cultural history and does not move chronologically. My excuse for the historical breadth is that the book covers, broadly, the history of the modern transition, from the age of George Eliot and Fanny and Stella to the post-tipping point antagonisms of online culture. The excuse for the progression is, as I've said, that I have preferred to organize my work logically rather than chronologically. The work moves between media and genres. It involves poetry, creative prose, criticism, philosophy, fiction, cinema, pop music, pornography, textual and video, and memes. Although this multi-generic breadth is not intended in itself to make an argument, nor is it surprising, since transition by design takes people out of one genre and deposits them in another, it is no surprise that a cultural history of gender transition will also provide, by accident, a history of genre transition.